This is the Porcelain Children of Blackmoor House, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. Big shout out to our listeners from the UK, and a special greeting to Larry from Texas. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Porcelain Children. The boiled egg arrived at precisely 4 minutes past 9, and Hercule Poirot was content. He sat at a corner table of the Marigold Café, a modest but scrupulously clean establishment overlooking the pier at Blackmoor-on-Sea, and regarded the egg with the expression of a man who has been pleasantly surprised by the world. The shell was perfect, or the toast soldiers were of uniform width. The coffee, though not of the continental refinement he preferred, had been delivered at a temperature that suggested the proprietress understood the gravity of such things. Beyond the salt-freckled window, the resort shimmered in the August heat. Children chased one another along the esplanade, trailing strings of pink candy floss. Women in white linen sat beneath striped parasols, their laughter carried away at intervals by a bright, an indiscriminate breeze. The sea was an extraordinary blue, the sort of blue, Poirot reflected, that one found on postcards and never quite believed in until one saw it. He had come to Blackmoor-on-Sea at the invitation of Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, whom he had encountered the previous spring at a soirée in Belgrave Square, and found, beneath her immaculate courtesy, possessed of a genuine and rather touching passion for antique porcelain. She had explained, were preparing a private exhibition of her collection. 22 dolls of rare 19th century French manufacture, acquired over 40 years of devoted pursuit. And she had expressed a wish that Monsieur Poirot might honour her with his presence at the unveiling. The invitation had arrived in a cream envelope sealed with a crest, and Miss Lemon had placed it upon his desk with the small, precise nod she reserved for correspondence she considered unlikely to cause difficulties. It was, hide on the face of it, an entirely delightful prospect. Sea air, civilized company, a collection of exquisite objects assembled with intelligence and taste. Poirot had packed his best suits, his patent leather shoes, and the small cedarwood box in which he kept his personal supply of tisane. He had instructed George to press everything twice. He had been in Blackmoor-on-Sea for precisely 3 hours. It was therefore somewhat early for the world to become complicated. He was crossing the pier, pausing, as was his custom, to admire the geometric arrangement of coloured bunting strung between the lampposts, when the young woman walked into him. Not accidentally, he was quite certain of that. She was perhaps 25, pale in the manner of someone who has been pale for a long time rather than temporarily unwell. Her dress was neat, forgettably brown, and her gloves were kid leather, the kind that cost more than the dress. The knuckles strained slightly at the joints as though the gloves had been put on in some haste or belonged to hands that had recently lost weight. Her eyes, when she lifted them to his, were of an indeterminate grey. Not dull, but watchful, the eyes of someone accustomed to observing without being observed. She glanced behind her, once, quickly. "You must leave Blackmoor House," she said. Her voice was barely above a murmur, and she did not stop moving, so that the words were delivered in the manner of a pickpocket, deft, targeted, and gone before their weight had registered. The children are not what they seem. Before Poirot could form the first syllable of a reply, she pressed something into his palm, cold, smooth, and very small, and stepped sideways into the holiday crowd with the ease of someone who has practiced disappearing. Poirot stood quite still for a moment. Around him the pier continued its cheerful commerce. A man with a tray of whelks, 2 boys arguing over a shilling, a dog barking at the railing above the water. None of it altered in the slightest. He opened his hand. It was a porcelain finger, approximately 3 centimetres in length, broken cleanly at the knuckle, the fracture fresh, white and sharp, not yellowed or abraded as old breaks become. It had not been in someone's pocket for years. It had been broken recently, perhaps within the last day. Poirot wrapped it carefully in his handkerchief and placed it in his breast pocket beside his heart. The sea continued its impossible blue, but the sunlight, he noticed, had taken on a theatrical quality. The bright, indifferent light of a stage set rather than an afternoon. He finished his walk and returned to change for the evening reception. Blackmoor House stood at the summit of the western headland. I reached by a chalk-pale road that wound between elder trees and arrived, after a final curve, at a pair of iron gates. The house itself was the kind that English families referred to as modest, while meaning nothing of the sort. A pale stone manor of French windows and long terrace views with urns of white roses at the entrance and immaculate yew hedges trimmed into the shapes of animals. A peacock, a running hound, something that might have been a child, and though it was difficult to say for certain, the geography, Poirot noted with professional habit, was instructive. High chalk cliffs on either side of the bay, 1 narrow road in, 1 narrow road out. At low tide, a strip of beach ran below the cliff path, accessible, if one was foolish, by a series of wooden steps worn smooth by weather. At high tide, the sea swallowed it completely, a landscape that presented the illusion of openness while being, in structural fact, entirely enclosed. A bowl, Poirot thought. A very beautiful bowl. The reception was held in the long drawing room overlooking the terrace, where the evening light lay golden across the parquet, and the smell of roses drifted in from the garden. Some 14 guests had assembled, and a small quartet played Schubert with the discreet competence of musicians who understand that their function is atmospheric rather than artistic. Lady Eleanor received him at the door. She was a tall woman, silver-haired, and draped in a rope of pearls that Poirot's practised eye placed in the category of genuine and considerable. Her smile was gracious, practised certainly, but not insincere. She possessed the particular manner of a woman who has been charming people for 60 years and no longer requires any effort to do so. She pressed his hand and said she was so very glad he had come, and Poirot believed her. Yet, as she turned to gesture toward the drawing room, he noticed, and with a small part of his mind that never entirely rested, that her fingers trembled slightly as they adjusted the nearest glass display case. He was introduced, in swift succession, to her son Thomas. A handsome man of perhaps 38, broad-shouldered and restless, who shook Poirot's hand with excessive firmness, and whose gaze, a moment later, drifted to the locked cabinets along the wall with an expression that was not admiration. To Dr. Marcus Vale, a child psychologist of some reputation, dark-eyed and pleasantly analytical, who watched the other guests with the patient attention of a man accustomed to reading rooms rather than inhabiting them. And to Iris Vale, Marcus's younger sister, so she was introduced, though the resemblance between them was not immediately obvious. A fair, slight woman whose health appeared fragile and whose eyes moved when she thought no one was watching, with a quickness that belied her stillness. Then at 8:30, Lady Eleanor called the room to attention. The Porcelain Children were unveiled. 20 dolls, each perhaps 30 centimetres tall, arranged in a mahogany and glass cabinet of considerable elegance. They were dressed in ivory lace, each face individually painted with an expression of such serene, unblinking composure that the overall effect was, despite their undeniable beauty, faintly unsettling. Their hands were folded, their heads were slightly bowed, and as though in uniform obedience to some instruction that had not required repeating. The guests murmured appreciatively. Lady Eleanor spoke of provenance, of acquisition, of restoration. Poirot listened with half his attention and gave the other half to the room. The way Thomas Ashcombe did not look at the dolls, the way Iris Vale did look at them, with something that might have been recognition. Then he looked more carefully at the dolls themselves. Each one bore, was along the porcelain of its wrists, a fine tracery of cracks, repaired, filled, painted over with extraordinary care, but visible nonetheless to an eye trained to notice what others overlooked. They had been broken, all of them, and all of them had been mended. He was still considering the significance of this when applause rose around him, and Lady Eleanor, flushed with pleasure, accepted a glass of champagne. Poirot did not applaud. He was counting. 20 stands in the cabinet, and 19 dolls. One stand stood empty, its small brass label read, in a copperplate hand, Clara. He slipped his hand into his breast pocket and felt the shape of the broken finger through the linen of his handkerchief. The Schubert continued. The roses drifted in on the evening air. Somewhere above the cliff, a gull screamed once, sharply, and was silent. Hercule Poirot smiled very slightly to himself. The storm had not yet broken, but he had heard quite distinctly the first low note of thunder. Chapter 2. The Empty Stand. Sleep that night did not come easily. Poirot lay in the guest bedroom that Lady Eleanor had assigned him, a large, well-appointed room with a view across the garden toward the cliff edge, and listened to the sea. It was not an unpleasant sound. Under ordinary circumstances he might have found it conducive to rest. But ordinary circumstances did not. As a rule, I involve a broken porcelain finger wrapped in his handkerchief on the bedside table. He rose at 6:30, dressed with his customary precision, and stood at the window for a time. The garden below lay in that particular state of early morning stillness which belongs exclusively to places that will be busy later. A stillness not of emptiness but of held breath. The yew hedges cast long shadows across the lawn, their topiary shapes distorted by the low angle of the light, so that the peacock resembled something winged and predatory, and the running hound appeared for a moment to be crouching. A figure moved along the far hedge with a pair of shears. The groundskeeper, a lean, unhurried man Poirot had observed briefly upon his arrival, was trimming the porcelain white roses that grew in disciplined rows along the yew's base. He worked without apparent haste, cutting each stem to precisely the same length. His movements held the quiet authority of someone who has performed the same task for many years and has long since ceased to think about it. Poirot watched him for rather longer than the activity warranted. Breakfast was served at 8 in a sunny room off the hall, and it was here that Poirot encountered, for the first time that morning, Thomas Ashcombe. Lady Eleanor's son was already at the table when Poirot arrived, and had evidently been there some time. His coffee cup was half empty, and he was reading a letter with the focused attention of someone who is not reading at all, but is thinking about something else entirely. He folded the letter when Poirot sat down, with a speed that might have been described in a court of law as furtive. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot." His tone was perfectly pleasant, but the jaw held a residual tension, like a door that has been firmly shut, but not quite latched. "Good morning." Poirot unfolded his napkin with care. "You slept well, I hope?" "Tolerably." Thomas reached for the toast rack and then, apparently reconsidering, set it down again. "My mother's enthusiasm for the exhibition tends to make the house rather active in the days preceding it. Staff up at all hours, things being moved. One becomes accustomed." "The collection is remarkable," Poirot said. He poured his coffee. "Though I confess I noticed last evening that the cabinet appeared to hold one stand without its occupant. A doll by the name of Clara." The toast rack, which Thomas had again extended a hand toward, was again abandoned. The movement was small, barely a hesitation, but it was there. "Clara is being restored," he said. "A hairline crack. My mother is particular about such things." He smiled briefly and without warmth. "She does not display anything imperfect." Poirot considered this. He said nothing. The coffee was, in fact, very good. Thomas excused himself shortly afterward, taking his unfinished letter with him. Poirot ate his egg, 3 minutes and 50 seconds, acceptable if not transcendent, and gave his attention to the pier visible from the breakfast room window, where the morning's first visitors were already drifting. He was thinking about the word restore. It was a word that meant, depending upon context, and either to return something to its original condition or to return something to a person from whom it had been taken. Both meanings in the present circumstances seemed potentially relevant. He found Dr. Vale in the library before 11. The room was long and dark-panelled, its shelves arranged with a collector's orderliness, books grouped by subject and size, the spines uniformly outward. Vale was standing at the window with a cup of tea he did not appear to be drinking, now looking out at the terrace with the particular quality of stillness that Poirot associated not with calm, but with controlled agitation. He turned at Poirot's entrance with a smile that arrived a fraction too promptly. "Monsieur Poirot, do come in. I was rather hoping for company." He gestured at the armchair beside the fireplace. "Lady Eleanor has vanished into her correspondence. Thomas has taken the car out and Iris is lying down. The house becomes curiously oppressive when everyone disperses." "It is a house that requires its inhabitants," Poirot agreed, sitting. "Tell me, you have been a guest here before, I think?" "Several times. Lady Eleanor and I share an interest in developmental psychology, the effect of early environment on identity formation. She is a more sophisticated thinker than people give her credit for." He paused. Or was? The qualification hung in the room. "Was?" Poirot repeated. It is with the air of a man repeating a word, only to confirm he has heard it correctly. "She is older," Vale said smoothly. "Her thinking has calcified somewhat in recent years. It happens." He set his untouched tea on the window-sill. "Are you here purely for the collection, Monsieur Poirot? Or has someone written to you?" The question was asked with perfect lightness. It was, nonetheless, a question. "I am here at Lady Eleanor's invitation," Poirot said, "as I believe are you." Vale smiled. Of course." They regarded one another for a moment with the mutual, courteous wariness of two chess players who have not yet determined which of them has white. Poirot spent the remainder of the morning in a purposeful manner that an observer might have mistaken for idle wandering. He examined the cliff path, noting the wooden steps and the state of the handrail, recently tightened at the top, loose at the third post from the bottom, the screws having worked free in the salt air. He walked the perimeter of the yew hedges and identified, at the garden's eastern boundary, a section that had been more recently trimmed than the rest, leaving a gap at its base large enough to admit a person of slight build, if they were willing to stoop. He returned through the kitchen garden and paused to exchange pleasantries with the cook, who informed him, among other things, that she had been in Lady Eleanor's employ for 11 years, that she thought the dolls gave her the creeps, and that the young woman who had arrived uninvited 2 evenings ago and been turned away at the door had been the colour of a sheet. This last piece of information Poirot received without visible alteration of expression, thanked her for the excellent coffee, and went upstairs to think. He was crossing the entrance hall when Iris Vale came down the staircase. She was dressed simply, in pale blue, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a headache or some subtler discomfort. She carried a book, a novel, its title turned toward her body. When she saw Poirot, she stopped, and he had the distinct impression that she had been hoping, quite specifically, not to encounter anyone. "Mademoiselle Vale, I hope you are feeling recovered." "Perfectly well, thank you." She descended the last 2 steps and paused at the hall table, and adjusting a vase of flowers that required no adjustment. "Have you seen Marcus this morning?" "In the library, a little while ago. He appeared in good health." She nodded, not quite looking at him. Her eyes settled, briefly and involuntarily, on the door to the drawing-room, and therefore on the doll cabinet beyond it, before moving away. "The collection is beautiful," Poirot offered. "You admired it last evening, I think. You are fond of such things?" A pause, a beat too long. I grew up around them," she said. And then, as though she had said more than she intended, "I was in service for a time, as a governess, in houses with collections." She excused herself and went out through the French windows onto the terrace, her book still unopened in her hand. Poirot stood in the hall and considered what she had said. The phrase was perfectly ordinary, unremarkable even, and yet she had reached for it with the slightly over-deliberate air of a woman producing a prepared explanation rather than a natural one. He was still in the hall when he heard from the direction of the pier a child's voice, high and carrying, the way voices are when they have no reason to be hushed. He went to the window. A girl was standing at the garden gate just beyond the iron posts. She appeared to be 12 or thereabouts, with the kind of sunburned practicality that belongs to children who spend their summers outdoors and not in schoolrooms. She was selling flowers, a flat basket of them hung from her arm. And she was looking with a steadiness quite unlike the habitual restlessness of her age, directly at the house. Then she looked directly at Poirot. He met her gaze. She did not look away. She did not smile or speak or make any gesture. She simply continued to look at him with that unnerving or level attention until the groundskeeper appeared from the side path and said something to her in a low voice, and she turned and walked back toward the pier without hurrying. Poirot attended the afternoon tea Lady Eleanor had arranged in the garden with every appearance of social ease, admiring the roses, accepting a second cup, deploying his most benign and decorative manner with the skill of a man who has spent 30 years being underestimated. He spoke to each guest. He listened carefully. He noted that Thomas did not return until the tea was nearly finished, that he smelled of cigarettes and a 20-minute drive, and that the letter he had carried from breakfast was no longer in his pocket. He noted, too, that when the drawing-room was briefly unattended between 6 and past, someone entered it. He could not say who. He heard only a footstep on the parquet. One footstep, then silence. And when he looked around the door, the room was empty and the doll cabinet was locked, as it had been all day. But one of the porcelain figures, the third from the left in the upper row, had been turned very slightly to face the door. None of the others had moved. Poirot regarded the doll for a long moment. Its painted expression was, like all its companions, one of serene and absolute composure. Its hands were folded, its head was bowed. Along its wrists ran the fine, mended tracery of old cracks. He reached into his breast pocket, felt the shape of the broken finger, and thought about the word Clara written in brass on an empty stand. Then he thought about what the young woman on the pier had said, and what she had not said, and what it might mean that she had known where to find him. He returned to his room, sat in the chair beside the window, and for the first time since his arrival, allowed himself to be entirely still. The little grey cells, as he was accustomed to calling them, had begun, quietly and without fanfare, to work. Chapter 3. The Rehearsal. The scream came at 5:20 in the morning, and it had the particular quality of a sound that does not know how to stop. Poirot was already awake. He had lain in the grey pre-dawn, turning over what the cook had told him, the uninvited young woman the colour of a sheet, and arranging it alongside Thomas's abandoned letter, the turned doll and the broken finger, in the manner of a man sorting objects on a table into an order that has not yet declared itself. He was on his second arrangement when the scream reached him through the open window, and he was at the cliff path, before most of the house had registered that something had occurred. The path descended steeply from the garden's eastern boundary, following the chalk headland down to the beach in a series of wooden-railed switchbacks. At the third and final landing, where the path met the shingle, a small group had already gathered. The groundskeeper, his shears still in hand, and a young constable from the town who had evidently been walking his early beat, and now stood with the expression of a man confronting something that has not yet resolved itself into a category. Clara Ashcombe lay on the shingle at the path's end. She was alive. This was the first thing Poirot established, crouching beside her with a rapidity that his patent shoes would not have suggested possible, and she was breathing shallow, rapid breaths. And her eyes, when they opened, moved without focus, the way eyes do when the mind is still deciding whether to return fully to the body. The second thing he established was that she had not simply fallen. Her arms were folded across her chest, wrists resting on her sternum. Her ankles were crossed at a precise and even angle. The position required either unconsciousness so profound that the body had settled into accidental symmetry, which Poirot's eye dismissed immediately, or the deliberate arrangement of someone who had placed her there after the fall, with care and a certain theatrical sensibility. He looked up the cliff path. A fall from the top, unaided, would not have deposited her here with such composure. She had come down the path, or been brought. The shingle near the bottom step showed disturbance consistent with dragging, not a tumble, and been arranged afterward. Whoever had done so had not been rushed. The third thing was the ribbon. A pale blue ribbon encircled her left wrist, tied in a neat, flat bow. Threaded through it, suspended against the inner wrist, was a porcelain finger. It was of the same manufacture and dimension as the one now in Poirot's breast pocket. The fracture surface matched in colour and sharpness. They had, he was quite certain, once belonged to the same hand. He did not touch it. He studied it with the focused attention of a man reading a sentence in an unfamiliar language, making sure he has the grammar correct before proceeding. The constable, whose name was Briggs, and who was 23 and doing his considerable best, asked whether he should send for the doctor. "Send for Dr. Vale," Poirot said, rising. "He is a guest at the house, also for your superior, if you please, and for Lady Eleanor, though I would ask you to be gentle in that latter communication. And, constable, nothing is to be touched, nothing moved, not so much as a pebble." Briggs went. The groundskeeper had not moved during any of this, and did not move now. He was watching Poirot with eyes that held a quality not of surprise, but of something very like expectation. "You found her?" Poirot asked. "Heard her," the man said. His name, Poirot recalled, was Pell. He spoke with the economy of someone who has concluded, at some point in his life, that words are a finite resource. "She was already down. I came along the lower path. The gate from the beach was open." "It is usually kept locked?" "Every night." Poirot looked at the iron gate set into the chalk at the path's foot. A barrier between the private beach access and the public shore. It stood open now, the padlock hanging loose on its hasp, not forced, unlocked with a key or with prior knowledge of the mechanism. He walked back to where Clara lay and examined, without touching, the area around her. On the flat chalk of the third landing, a surface that held impressions after rain, and there had been a light shower before midnight, he identified 3 distinct sets of footprints. Clara's own pointing downward and irregular, as though she had descended in haste or distress. A second set, eye pointing in both directions. Someone who had come down and gone back up. And a third, very faint, near the doll. The doll. He had registered it in his first survey and filed it for closer attention. It lay on the shingle approximately 18 inches from Clara's right hand. A porcelain doll's head, separated from any body, its face turned upward toward the brightening sky. The face had been repainted. The features, the arch of the brows, the set of the mouth, yet the particular line of the jaw, were not those of a French doll manufactured in 1887. They were Clara Ashcombe's. The likeness was not crude, it was accomplished. It had required a clear model, a photograph or prolonged observation, and a hand sufficiently skilled to render it in glaze on a curved surface. Such work took time. Such work had been planned. At the base of the doll's neck, where the porcelain met the first curve of the collar, words had been written in red glaze. The lettering was small and even and entirely without haste. Children who misbehave must be mended. Poirot straightened up slowly. The sun was now clearing the eastern cliff, and the shingle caught the light and became, briefly, almost beautiful. Behind him he heard voices on the upper path. The house was waking. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the handkerchief. He unfolded it and looked at the broken finger within it. He looked at the ribbon on Clara's wrist. He looked at the doll's head with its painted accusation. The young woman on the pier had known this was coming. She had not warned him about a crime that might occur. She had warned him about a crime already in preparation, already aimed, already, in its essential character, underway. He replaced the handkerchief carefully and turned at the sound of Marcus Vale descending the path at speed, medical bag in hand, and his face composed in the particular way that doctors compose their faces when they do not yet know what they are going to find. Vale knelt beside Clara and conducted his examination with competence and dispatch. He reported what Poirot had already observed. Vital signs stable, no fractures immediately apparent, probable concussion. He did not comment on the arrangement of the arms or the crossing of the ankles, and Poirot noted carefully that he did not comment. "You know, she should be moved inside," Vale said, standing. "Presently," said Poirot. "The constable superior is coming. A few minutes will make no material difference to Madame Ashcombe, and may make a considerable difference to our understanding of the night's events." He paused. "You knew she was here. In Blackmoor-on-Sea, I mean. Before this morning." Vale's eyes met his with perfect steadiness. "I knew she had been at the house 2 evenings ago. Lady Eleanor told me." "And did Lady Eleanor tell you why she was turned away?" "She said Clara had no business here any longer, that the marriage was finished and the connection with it." He glanced down at Clara, and something moved behind his eyes that was not easily named. "Lady Eleanor has views about connections." The local inspector arrived at 7:30, a solid, methodical Hampshire man named Crow, who took in the scene without theatre and began issuing sensible instructions. But Poirot presented himself, mentioned his name with the modest confidence of a man accustomed to that name, producing a specific effect, and watched Crow revise his initial assessment of the situation. "I have heard of you, of course," Crow said, with the air of a man who will not be deflected from his duty, but is prepared to acknowledge useful allies. "I should be glad of your observations, Monsieur Poirot, if you're willing." "I am willing," said Poirot, "though I will also offer you, without being asked, my conclusion. This is not a fall, it is not an assault in the ordinary sense. What occurred here last night was staged, arranged. The person responsible wished it to be found by me, specifically, and wished its meaning to be unmistakable." Crow looked at the doll's head and the ribbon and the folded arms. "A madman," he said. "No," Poirot said with quiet certainty. "Someone very sane indeed. A madman makes disorder. This—" He gestured at the precise, deliberate composition on the shingle. "Is the opposite of disorder. This is a signature. This is a person telling us, with considerable care, exactly who they are and what they intend." He looked up at the house, white and composed against the morning sky, its yew animals casting their long, distorted shadows. "What they intend," he repeated more quietly, "is not yet finished." He excused himself, climbed the chalk path back to the house, and went directly to his room. He sat at the writing desk, uncapped his pen and wrote 4 names in a column on a clean sheet of paper. Then he drew lines between them and sat looking at the lines for a long time. After a while he crossed out one line and drew it differently. Then he opened the desk's small side drawer, placed the porcelain finger inside it, locked it, and put the key in his waistcoat pocket. In the garden below, the groundskeeper had resumed his trimming. I'm as though nothing had altered in the world. Chapter 4. One child. Each day by 9 o'clock, the house had acquired the particular atmosphere of a place that has decided, collectively and without discussion, to behave as though nothing has happened. Breakfast was served. Toast was made. Lady Eleanor appeared in the dining room at 9:20 in a morning dress of lavender wool, her pearls in place, and accepted a cup of tea with the composure of a woman who has been schooled, since childhood, in the proposition that composure is its own form of courage. She did not ask about Clara. Poirot noted this as he would have noted the absence of a signature on a document, not proof of anything in itself, but a fact requiring explanation. Inspector Crowe had been and gone, taking statements with the methodical patience of a man who distrusts shortcuts and has usually been proved right to do so. He had removed the doll's head in an evidence bag, sealed the cliff path, and advised the household that no one was to depart Blackmoor-on-Sea without informing his office. He had done all of this without once raising his voice, which Poirot considered an indicator of genuine competence. Before leaving, he had drawn Poirot aside at the garden gate and said in a tone that managed to be simultaneously collegial and cautious that he would be grateful if Monsieur Poirot might keep him informed of any observations the household circumstances might produce. And Poirot had agreed with the qualification, delivered pleasantly but without room for negotiation, that he would require the library for his own use, unrestricted access to the ground floor of the house, and a list of the guests' full names and London addresses by afternoon. Crowe had assented to all three. The library was a room that rewarded occupation. Its long windows gave on to the west garden, where the light in the morning was indirect and cool, and its shelves contained, alongside the expected volumes of history and estate management, a rather surprising collection of books on child development, educational philosophy, and the psychology of early attachment. Several of these had been heavily annotated in a hand that was small and precise, and, Poirot observed, entirely consistent with the handwriting on the label beneath the empty doll stand. Lady Eleanor's hand. A mind that had spent decades thinking, in one form or another, and about children and what they owed to those who shaped them. He was arranging what he knew, which was rather less than he wished, across the library's central table when George appeared in the doorway. George was Poirot's manservant, and he had arrived on the morning train at Poirot's telegram, carrying a second valise and the cedarwood tisane box, and the expression of a man who has learned through long experience that his employer's sudden requirements for a second valise generally precede complications. He set the valise down, cast an eye over the table's arrangement of notes, and said that he hoped Monsieur Poirot had slept adequately. Tolerably, George. Tolerably. Poirot accepted the tisane that George produced from the valise with the efficiency of a conjurer and the manner of a nurse. What is the mood of the house? Tense, sir. The kitchen believes it was an accident. The housemaid is less certain. Mr. Thomas Ashcombe has been on the telephone twice since breakfast, and the second call lasted 11 minutes. To London. The exchange operator is an acquaintance of the housemaid's cousin, sir. I understand the number belongs to a firm of solicitors in Gray's Inn. Poirot set down his tisane cup with a precision that was, in itself, a form of punctuation. 11 minutes, he said. Yes, sir. Thank you, George. That will be all for the moment. He sat for a time after George had withdrawn, fingers steepled beneath his chin, regarding the arrangement of names on the table. Thomas Ashcombe telephoning a solicitor before the household had finished its second cup of tea. Not the police, not a relation, a solicitor. This was a man whose first instinct upon finding his estranged wife arranged on the shingle below the family estate was to consider not her welfare but the legal implications of her presence. Interesting. Though not, Poirot admitted to himself, necessarily incriminating. Fear takes many forms, and some of them wear a suit. The note arrived at 11:30. It had been placed, not slipped, placed with deliberate flatness, beneath the library door. An envelope of good quality cream paper, his name on the front in the same even copper plate that had lettered the doll's inscription. Inside was a single folded sheet. He opened it with a letter knife and read it at the table without sitting down. 5 names were written in a column. Clara Ashcombe stood at the top, a single horizontal line drawn neatly through it. Not an erasure but a completion, the mark a schoolmaster makes beside a finished task. The 4 names beneath were Iris Vale, Dr. R. Vale, Thomas Ashcombe, E. Ashcombe. At the bottom of the page, in the same unhurried hand, 1 child each day until the cabinet is complete. Poirot placed the note on the table beside his own papers and looked at it for a long while. Then he went to the drawing-room, unlocked the doll cabinet with the key Lady Eleanor had provided him that morning. She had offered it without his asking, which itself was worth examining, and counted the stands. 22 in total. 19 dolls present. 3 stands empty. Clara's he had known about. The other 2 empty stands bore labels he had not previously read closely. One said Marguerite, what the other, in slightly newer brass, said simply Ward. He counted again. Then he counted the names on the note. 5 names. 5 empty stands, if one included the 2 already vacant. The mathematics had a terrible tidiness. He was still before the cabinet when he became aware that he was not alone in the room. Thomas Ashcombe stood in the doorway. He had changed since breakfast into a jacket that suggested he had intended to go out and then reconsidered. And he was watching Poirot with an expression that had moved some distance beyond mere tension into something more candid and less comfortable. "You've found something," Thomas said. It was not quite a question. "I find things continually," Poirot replied, turning from the cabinet. "It is my difficulty as much as my gift. The question is always, which things matter?" He regarded Thomas with the mild, open attention that had caused more than one person, over the years, to say more than they had planned to. "You telephoned a solicitor this morning." Thomas's jaw tightened, then released, in the manner of a man who has decided that denial is more trouble than the alternative. Clara's presence here, her being found here, complicates things. There are legal matters outstanding between us. Arrangements. He moved to the fireplace and rested one hand on the mantelpiece, a posture that managed to suggest both authority and unease. "I didn't hurt her, if that's what you're working toward." "I am not working toward anything, mon ami. I am merely noting directions." Poirot moved to the window. Outside, the garden lay in the high brightness of late morning, the sea beyond the cliffs a flat, relentless blue. "Tell me about the dolls, your mother's collection. When did it begin?" The shift of subject visibly unsettled Thomas more than the previous line of inquiry. He removed his hand from the mantelpiece. I don't see what that has to do with—" "Indulge me." A pause. Then, She began collecting when I was a boy. After my father died, she said they were companions, presences. She used that word. His mouth compressed briefly. She had a nursery rearranged for them when I was 12. My nursery. And was it Clara's name on the stand before the doll named Clara was acquired? Or was the doll named after someone already? The silence that followed this question was of a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. Thomas looked at Poirot with an expression from which several emotions appeared to be competing for the surface, and none of them quite reaching it. "I think you should ask my mother," he said at last. Poirot would have done precisely that, but the afternoon's events intervened. It was Crow's constable, young Briggs, still doing his considerable best, who brought word at 4 o'clock, arriving at the garden gate at a pace that communicated urgency, without resolving into anything so undignified as a run. He had found the girl, the flower-selling girl from the pier. She had been discovered attempting to enter the garden through the eastern boundary of the yew hedge, specifically through the gap at its base that Poirot had identified on his morning survey. She had not succeeded. Ipel, the groundskeeper, had found her and held her firmly, but without unkindness, until Briggs could be fetched. She had not struggled. She had simply waited in the manner of someone who expected to be caught and had decided to remain dignified about it. In her flower basket, beneath a layer of late summer marigolds and the tissue paper in which she wrapped her stems, lay a porcelain hand, 4 fingers and a thumb intact, the wrist end broken, with the fracture surface identical in colour and character to the single finger Poirot had locked in the desk drawer above. A match, not metaphorically, but literally, the same hand. Poirot crouched before the girl in the garden. She met his gaze with the same unnerving level steadiness she had shown him through the window 2 days prior. She was perhaps 12, or a tall 10. Her name, she said, when asked directly, was Nell. "Who gave you this? Nell?" She considered the question with more deliberation than most children grant adults. "A lady," she said. "She said to bring it to the house, to the garden, and leave it where it would be found. She said someone here was expecting it." "What did this lady look like?" Nell described with the unsentimental precision of a child who has learned to observe rather than to interpret. A pale young woman in a brown dress, with kid gloves that were a little too tight, and eyes the colour of rain. Poirot stood. He looked at the porcelain hand in the basket, and he looked at the gap in the yew hedge, and he looked at the house. The young woman from the pier had not disappeared. She was still here, moving at the edges of things, sending pieces toward him like a player advancing pawns. She had warned him. Now she was feeding him evidence. And someone, the same person or another, had, on the same morning she moved her pieces, it arranged a woman on a shingle beach like a broken doll. The game, as he had suspected from the first, had more than one player. He thanked Nell gravely, instructed Briggs to take her home and ascertain whether she could be found again if required, and went back inside. In the library, he added a 6th name to his paper. Below the 5 on the note, "I'll be separated by a line," and sat looking at it as the afternoon light shifted across the garden and the yew animals lengthened into something indistinguishable from shadow. The 6th name was a question, not an answer. But questions, Poirot had long since concluded, were where the truth invariably hid. Chapter 5. Porcelain Remembers. Clara Ashcombe had been placed in the blue room at the end of the first-floor corridor. which was the room furthest from Lady Eleanor's own apartments and closest to the servants' stair. Poirot noted both facts without comment. Dr. Vale had declared her concussed, but not gravely injured, and by the morning following her discovery, she had graduated from unconsciousness to a state of agitated wakefulness that the household appeared to find, in various degrees, inconvenient. Lady Eleanor had not visited, and Thomas had stood in the doorway for 4 minutes on the previous afternoon, and then retreated without entering. Iris Vale had brought broth, which Clara had accepted and had remained for 20 minutes, during which time Poirot had stationed himself in the corridor with a month-old copy of the Times, and learned rather more from the silences between the two women than he might have done from their words. He requested an interview with Clara at 10 o'clock, yet knocking at the blue room door with a formality that he felt the circumstances warranted. She received him sitting up against the pillows, her dark hair loose, a bruise along her left cheekbone that had ripened overnight from plum to a more considered purple. She looked at him with the clear, assessing gaze of someone who has spent the night deciding how much to trust strangers. He sat in the chair beside the window, adjusted its angle slightly. It had been positioned facing the wall, an arrangement that offended both his aesthetic sense and his practical instincts, and told her without preamble that he had found the doll's head. Something shifted in her face. Not fear exactly. She had, he suspected, already passed through the territory of fear and arrived at something harder and more durable. "Then you know," she said, "that it was not random." "I have known that since the beginning. What I do not yet know is the whole of the history, yet the part that preceded my arrival." He folded his hands in his lap. "You came to Blackmoor House 2 evenings before you were found on the beach. You were turned away. Why did you come?" She looked at the window for a moment, at the strip of brilliant sea visible above the garden hedge. "To warn them," she said. "Or, no, that is not entirely truthful. I came because I had received a letter, and the letter told me that what happened in this house had not finished happening, that there was someone who intended to make it visible." She turned back to him. "I thought if I came, I could prevent it. Speak to Lady Eleanor. Arrange something quietly." A brief, mirthless pause. "I was naive." "The letter? You have it?" "I burned it. That was also naive." She touched the bruise along her cheekbone with 2 fingers, the gesture of a woman taking an inventory. It said that the children of this house had not been forgotten, that someone remembered what was owed to them. I did not know what that meant precisely, but I understood enough. "You were a child of this house," Poirot said. Not a question. Clara was still for a moment. Then, "I was Thomas's wife. That is how I came to know it. And in knowing it, you came to know what manner of house it was." The silence that followed had the quality of a door opening rather than closing. "They never let you grow up in that house," she said at last. Her voice had changed. The careful, a considered register had gone, replaced by something flatter and more unguarded. "You must stay perfect, silent, beautiful, or you are mended." She said the word as though it had a taste she found familiar and unpleasant. That is what Lady Eleanor calls it, mending. When someone behaves incorrectly, speaks too freely, shows some part of themselves that has not been approved, she mends them, isolates them, reframes them, removes the people around them until they are shaped again into whatever she requires. This was done to you. For 4 years. My friendships were managed. My correspondence arrived already opened. Thomas was told, repeatedly and with great gentleness, what I was: unstable, emotional, unsuited to the responsibilities of the house. He believed her for longer than I have entirely forgiven him. She said this last without particular heat, as a statement of fact rather than an accusation. I was not bruised. I was erased. Poirot was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gull called once, the sound scoured clean by the wind off the water. "And who," he asked gently, "decided when you were broken?" Clara's eyes filled briefly and without her permission, before she marshalled them. "Lady Eleanor," she said. "Always Lady Eleanor." He left her to rest and walked, with the purposeful unhurriedness that was characteristic of his investigations at their most productive, toward the old wing of the property. It was George who had mentioned the greenhouse, obliquely in the manner of a man who conveys information by describing its surroundings, noting that Pell, the groundskeeper, used only the new glasshouse near the kitchen garden, and had not, to anyone's knowledge, entered the old greenhouse at the estate's eastern boundary in some considerable time. The path to it ran behind the yew hedge and through a gate in the kitchen garden wall. At the greenhouse itself was a Victorian structure of cast iron and clouded glass, its panes furred with years of uncleaned salt and the particular organic blur of undisturbed growth. The door, when Poirot tried it, was unlocked. The lock mechanism, he noted, bore no rust at the joint. It had been used recently. Inside, the smell was chalk dust, old heat, and something chemical beneath it that he identified after a moment as glaze. On the shelves that ran the length of both walls, shelves which should, in an abandoned greenhouse, have held terracotta pots and seed trays, stood rows of porcelain components: hands, forearms, small rounded heads in various states of completion, moulds of fired clay. And at the far end, beneath the least clouded section of glass, a small kiln, its interior still warm to the palm held 3 inches from its door. Someone had been working here, working with skill and regularity. The doll's pieces were not crude experiments, but accomplished fabrications, their surfaces smooth, their proportions exact, their glazework of the kind that required both training and patience. He was examining a mould, its inner surface pressed with the features of a face he was beginning to recognize, when he heard footsteps on the path outside. Deliberate footsteps, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew he was there. The door handle turned, then stopped, other than the sound of something being drawn across it, a bolt or a bar from the outside. A solid, definitive sound. Poirot tried the door. It did not move. He was, on the whole, not a man who panicked. He stood quite still for a moment and conducted a rapid survey of the greenhouse's dimensions and exits. 1 door, 8 panes along each side wall at a height manageable with assistance. The roof vents too small. At the door's base, a thread of smoke had begun to uncurl. Thin, grey. I unhurried, carrying the dry, acrid scent of peat. Someone had lit the peat stacks banked against the outer wall. He did not waste time on the lower panes, which were thick and set in iron. He located, by the economy of a quick inspection, the single pane in the upper row of the south wall where the leading had corroded to a state of structural uncertainty, took 2 steps back, swung his cane in the tight, the controlled arc of a man who has played boules in his youth and remembers the principle of it, and put the ferrule through the glass at its weakest point. The pane did not shatter cleanly. Nothing in a salt-corroded Victorian greenhouse shatters cleanly, but it gave in pieces, and he used the cane to clear the frame with 3 precise strikes. He was a small man, and this was, on this particular afternoon, an advantage. He climbed through with considerable loss of dignity and a cut across the back of his left hand that was, in his estimation, a fair price. He landed on the far side of the hedge, brushed the glass from his sleeve, and pressed his handkerchief against the cut with the application of a man who has decided that composure is the most useful response available to him. Behind him, through the greenhouse glass, the smoke had thickened. The shelves of porcelain components were lost in haze. He looked toward the yew hedge. A figure stood at the hedge's far corner, in the thin shadow between 2 of the topiary animals. Still. Watching. And then, unmistakably, deliberately, with the measured composure of someone who has rehearsed the gesture. The figure brought its hands together, once, twice, 3 times, applauding. Poirot looked at the figure for precisely the 3 seconds it remained visible before stepping back into the hedge's shadow and disappearing. It was slight, though it wore brown. He walked back to the house with his handkerchief pressed to his hand, and his mind conducting, beneath its usual orderly surface, a rapid and thorough reassessment of everything he thought he had understood about the game being played at Blackmoor House. The young woman from the pier had sent him a warning, sent him evidence through the child Nell, and now stood in gardens she should not have been able to enter, and watched him escape a fire she had not set. No, she was not the architect of this. She was its audience, or its instrument. The distinction mattered enormously, and he did not yet know which was true. In the library, he unwrapped his hand, asked George for lint and the iodine he had been prudent enough to pack, and sat very still while George attended to the cut with professional discretion and no commentary whatsoever. "The kiln in the greenhouse," Poirot said. "Someone has been using it, recently and regularly. I want to know who had access to the old wing, and who among the household or its recent visitors has any training in ceramics or restoration work." "I will make inquiries, sir," George said, in the tone that meant he had already been making them. "Gently," Poirot added, and then, unexpectedly, sharply, as Constable Briggs appeared at the library door, with an expression that had left careful neutrality some distance behind. "What is it?" Briggs delivered his information in a single sentence, and the sentence had the quality of a stone dropped into still water. Miss Iris Vale was not in her room. She was not in the house. She had not been seen since 2:30, and it was now 4:15. Poirot stood immediately, wrapping his hand himself, the iodine not yet dry. His eye went to the window, to the gardens in their long afternoon light, to the cliff edge visible beyond the yew. "The cabinet," he said. "Go and look at the cabinet." Briggs went. He returned in under 2 minutes, and his face confirmed what Poirot had already, with a cold and settled certainty, deduced. A new figure stood in the cabinet, on the stand that had that morning been empty. It was dressed in pale blue. Its hair was fair. Its face, painted with the same accomplished hand that had rendered Clara's on the shingle, wore an expression of perfect, unblinking composure. Poirot looked at it for 1 moment only. Then he was already moving. So Chapter 6. The Tide and its Logic. The telephone in Lady Eleanor's study rang at 12 minutes past midnight. Poirot was not asleep. He had been sitting at the library table in his dressing gown since 11, the lamp low, the 5 names on their paper rearranged for the 4th time into an order that still did not quite satisfy him. He heard the telephone through 2 closed doors and was in the corridor before the 2nd ring had finished, reaching the study ahead of George, ahead of the sleepy housemaid, ahead of anyone except the night itself. He lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, and entirely without identifiable affect. The voice of someone who has thought carefully about how to sound. "The pavilion," it said, "the lower floor. The tide table on the hall table will tell you what you need to know about urgency." The line went dead. Poirot replaced the receiver and turned to the hall table in a single movement. The tide table was a printed card tucked beneath the vase of roses. Standard issue, the kind distributed by the harbour authority to every guest house in the town. He had passed it a dozen times without attending to it. He attended to it now. High tide, 12:47. It was currently 12:14. 33 minutes. He was dressed and on the Esplanade Road in 4 of them, moving at a pace that drew one brief, startled look from the constable on the night beat before the man recognized him and fell, without being asked, into step beside him. The pavilion was a Regency structure at the pier's landward end. White-painted cast iron and frosted glass, used in season for dancing and in the winter months for storage. In August, it operated as a tea room during the day, its lower floor given over to deck chair hire and the keeping of beach equipment. And at this hour, its upper windows were dark, its lower floor accessed by a flight of exterior steps that descended to a door some 8 feet below the promenade level, was not dark. Through the frosted glass, a light moved irregularly, a torch beam or a lantern caught by the motion of water. Water. The lower door was already half submerged, the sea having reached the 3rd step of the exterior stair and continuing its patient advance. Poirot looked at it for precisely 1 second, processing angle and depth and the particular sound of enclosed water moving against walls, then turned to the constable. "The upper entrance, quickly." The constable, whose name was Aldrin and who was built on more practical lines than young Briggs, had the upper door open with his shoulder in under a minute. They went through down the internal stair, and Poirot felt the water before he saw it. A cold presence rising to his ankles even on the 3rd step from the bottom, but the lower floor already a shallow, churning lake, reflecting the torch beam in fragments. Iris Vale stood on the deck chair counter, the last surface above the waterline, her back against the far wall. The water was at the counter's edge and climbing. Around her right wrist, tied with the same pale blue ribbon he had now seen twice, floated a porcelain doll, its white dress spread on the surface like a small, obscene flower. She was conscious. She was, by a considerable exercise of will, calm. When the torch beam found her face, she turned toward it, without crying out. The reaction of someone who has been in the dark long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was steady, though her teeth were not quite. The constable waded forward. Poirot caught his arm. "The chair," he said, indicating the nearest deck chair stacked against the wall 3 feet to his right, still above the waterline. "The glass. 1 blow, to the lower left pane. The leading is corroded." He had observed this on his morning survey the 2nd day, cataloguing without particular intent. Intent had arrived after the fact. She must not go under. Aldrin understood, retrieved the chair with 2 strides, and brought its metal frame against the lower pane with the uncomplicated authority of a man, untroubled by second thoughts. The glass gave. Water began to drain, slowly at first, and then with gathering purpose, and through the widening gap and down the exterior steps into the sea below, returning with a kind of logic to the element from which it had come. It took 6 minutes for the floor to clear enough to wade to the counter, and another 3 before Iris could be helped, shaking and drenched, through the upper door and into the night air. Poirot untied the ribbon from her wrist himself with careful fingers, keeping the knot intact. The doll drifted free and bumped gently against the skirting board. He left it for Crow's men. He sat beside Iris on the promenade bench, while Aldrin went for blankets and the sensible competence of the town's night doctor. The sea glittered beyond the pier rail, entirely indifferent to what it had nearly accomplished. "How did you come to be there?" he asked when her breathing had settled. "A note," she said. "Under my door while I was dressing for dinner. It said that there was someone at the pavilion who could tell me the truth about my family, about who I was." She turned to look at him, and in the lamplight her expression held something beyond the residue of fear, a kind of exhausted recognition, as though an answer she had dreaded for a long time had finally arrived, and she found it was no worse than the waiting. "I have always known there was something I was not being told. Marcus deflects. Lady Eleanor deflects. Everyone in that house deflects, Monsieur Poirot, as naturally as breathing. And the person who was supposedly waiting for you. There was no one. The door was locked from the outside when I arrived. I had not been there 5 minutes before I heard the water." Poirot nodded once, slowly. The timing had been exact. Whoever had sent the note had known both the tide table and Iris's movements with a precision that required either very close observation or very intimate knowledge of the household. And the distance between those 2 things was narrowing. "It is not about the dolls," Iris said abruptly. The words had the quality of something that had been pressing for release. "It is about the inheritance, the estate, who is owed what and by whom and what was taken." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Is that not so?" Poirot said nothing. He had learned over many years that silence in the right place functions as a key. "Marcus told me once, only once, years ago when he had drunk rather more than was characteristic of him, that I had not always been his sister, that I had been given to him, that there were people who had decided, for reasons he was not at liberty to explain, that my life should be simpler if I did not know from whom." She paused. He never spoke of it again, and I pretended for his sake and my own that I had forgotten. The blanket arrived, and the doctor and the necessary business of shock and warmth and practical kindness intervened. Poirot stood at the pier rail and looked at the water and let his mind move over what she had told him with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to objects that had more surfaces than were immediately visible. Given to Marcus. Not adopted in the formal sense. Given. And as one gives a thing away when its presence has become a difficulty. He thought of the library shelves at Blackmoor House, the books on early attachment, on identity formation, on the developmental consequences of disrupted belonging. He thought of Lady Eleanor's annotating hand, precise and small, in the margins of those books. He thought of the brass labels in the doll cabinet, and the one that read ward, and what that word meant in its older, less clinical usage. A ward, a child in someone else's legal care, a child whose name and origin and claim could be managed by the person who held the wardship. He thought of the greenhouse and the accomplished porcelain work and the mould he had held before the fire drove him out, the mould pressed with a face he had been on the edge of recognizing. He had not, at the time, been certain. He was certain now. The face in the mould was Iris's. Someone had been making her doll for some time before this week. Someone had been preparing the cabinet's final occupant with patience and craftsmanship, and a specific, deeply held purpose that had nothing to do with porcelain and everything to do with the estate that Blackmoor House enclosed and the succession that controlled it. He walked back to the house through the pre-dawn dark, his shoes ruined by salt water, his dressing gown a diplomatic loss, and his mind in the particular state of rapid, pleasurable agitation he associated with the moment when what has been a collection of separate things becomes, at last, the outline of a single thing. George was waiting in the library with dry clothes and the expression of a man who has decided that commentary on the state of the dressing gown would be poorly timed. "The names on the list," Poirot said, sitting to change his shoes. "Clara, Iris, Marcus Vale, Thomas, Lady Eleanor." He looked up. "These are not guests, George. They are not random targets. They are all, in one form or another, people whose connection to this house, whose knowledge of its history, could threaten or confirm a claim." "A claim to the estate, sir?" "To everything. The house, the money, the name, everything that a family holds." He stood, straightened his cuffs with two precise movements. "Someone has been very patient and very clever. They have also, tonight, made a mistake." "What mistake is that?" "Aye, sir." "They underestimated how much Mademoiselle Iris already knows about herself." Poirot looked at the paper on the table with its column of names and its single crossed line. "And they overestimated how long it would take me to understand why." He picked up his pen and drew, carefully and deliberately, a line. Not through a name this time, but between two of them, connecting what had until this moment appeared to be separate points. Then he sat back and looked at what he had drawn, and felt beneath the urgency and the damp and the certain knowledge that the night's events were not yet finished, the quiet, precise satisfaction of a man who has found the shape of the thing at last. Chapter 7. What the Lullaby Knows. He spread the fragment of sheet music on the library table at 2:30 in the morning, and looked at it with the same still attention he might have given a letter, in a language he spoke imperfectly, but understood well enough to catch the tone. It had been in his possession since the second morning, retrieved with gloved fingers from the hollow skull of the doll's head, found beside Clara on the shingle. Inspector Crowe had the doll's head itself, but Poirot had made a careful copy of the musical fragment before surrendering it, his notation precise if his musical hand was unbeautiful. A single bar, 4 notes in the treble, a simple accompanying figure in the bass, the key of F 3/4 time, a lullaby, or he had known immediately. What he had not said aloud and had been sitting with in the particular discomfort of unprocessed recognition was this: he knew it, not from concert halls or music boxes or the general stock of European nursery melody. He knew it from his mother's kitchen in Spa on winter evenings when the stove was lit and the window had gone opaque with cold, and her voice had moved through it with the unself-conscious ease of something learned before memory begins. A Belgian lullaby. Not French, not Dutch, not a piece that would be known outside a specific region of a specific small country, unless one had been raised within it, or had studied its folk music with deliberate and purposeful attention. The killer knew him. Or, and here was the alternative he had been turning over since the night of the reception, the killer had studied him, had acquired the fact of his origins and his mother and this particular song through research, and had deployed it not because it was true knowledge, but because it was intended to feel like true knowledge. A psychological maneuver. The creation, in the investigator's mind, of the sensation of being personally known, which is a subtler and more disabling thing than being physically threatened. He had been meant to feel watched, understood. Perhaps, in some dark corner of the intention, unnerved. He found, examining his own response with the clinical honesty he applied to everything, that he was not unnerved. He was interested. The question was not who had been watching him. The question was, who had the leisure, the intellect, and the particular cast of mind to study a retired Belgian detective in sufficient depth to unearth a lullaby from his childhood, and to regard that study as relevant preparation for what was being done at Blackmoor House. He looked at the line connecting two names on his paper. Dr. Marcus Vale, a child psychologist, a man who, by professional formation and personal inclination, studied people, their histories, their formative landscapes, the early material out of which character and vulnerability are alike constructed. A man who watched rooms rather than inhabited them. A man who had raised a child, not his sister, as though she were. And Iris, who had been given to him, who had grown up beside him in the long shadow of a truth that was never spoken, but was, she had told Poirot, always somehow present. A pressure behind the walls of ordinary life, like water finding its level. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and wrote, in the deliberate manner of a man assembling a mechanism, what he now believed to be true. Iris was not Marcus Vale's sister. She had been presented as such, informally, practically, in the way of people making the best available arrangement, when she was still too young to interrogate the arrangement. Her true origin was Blackmoor House. Be more specifically, Lady Eleanor's family, on the wrong side of a boundary that the early years of the century had regarded as impassable. An illegitimate grandchild, perhaps. A child born to someone who could not keep her, and to a father whose acknowledgement would have produced in that household a scandal of the kind that reshapes fortunes. Lady Eleanor had managed it. Lady Eleanor managed things. She had placed the child, altered the relevant documents, adjusted the inheritance accordingly, and continued her life with the composed efficiency of a woman accustomed to treating human inconveniences as problems of administration. Thomas Ashcombe was therefore not the sole rightful heir. He might, depending on the precise configuration of the relevant instruments, not be the primary heir at all. The estate, the house, the investments, the considerable accumulated weight of several generations of careful money was worth fighting for. Worth was if one were of a sufficiently determined and sufficiently injured disposition, engineering a very elaborate public reckoning to recover. Poirot set down his pen and looked at what he had written. Then he looked at the lullaby fragment, and at the list of names, and at the line he had drawn between two of them. The attacks on the list's 5 names were not random, and they were not. This he now understood with the clarity of a thing that has been true all along, but required the right angle of light to become visible. primarily about harm. Clara had not been killed. Iris had not been drowned. The intention was not murder. The intention was testimony. Each staged scene was a document. Each ribbon and doll and glaze inscription was evidence of a pattern. The same pattern that had operated in this house for decades, now made literal and theatrical and impossible to dismiss. Someone was building a case, not in a court of law, but in the court of undeniable public fact. They were forcing the hidden history of Blackmoor House into the open air where it could not be managed away. The true crime, Poirot understood with a cold and settling certainty, was not this week's. It was 15 years old at minimum. It was a child removed from her name and her inheritance and her right to know either. And the body, if there was a body, was not on any beach or cliff path. It was in a document, in the deliberate, legally accomplished erasure of a person who had inconvenienced a family's sense of itself. He rose and went to the window. The garden was dark, the U-shapes invisible, the sea a faint brightness at the edge of the world. He thought about the greenhouse fire and reoriented it. He had understood the fire as an attempt on his life. He revised this now. He had been led to the greenhouse with some care. Pell's mention of it to George had been, he now considered, rather too conveniently placed. He had been shown the kiln and the moulds and the porcelain work. He had been given, in other words, evidence. The locking of the door had not been meant to kill him. A man who wished to kill Hercule Poirot would not rely on peat smoke in a Victorian greenhouse with a corroded south wall. It had been meant to keep him occupied long enough for the figure at the hedge to confirm that he had seen what he was meant to see. The fire had been set to destroy the workshop before the physical evidence of it became inconvenient, and Poirot had been led there to see it first. He had been, from the beginning, not a detective investigating a crime. He had been an audience, carefully cultivated, for a performance that required a credible witness. "You are clever," he said aloud to the dark window and whoever it contained. "And so am I." He returned to the table and retrieved, from the inner pocket of the jacket he had not changed before sitting down to think, the card that George had placed on the hall table that afternoon. A London address, a firm of inquiry agents that Poirot had employed on 3 previous occasions and found thorough and discreet. George had anticipated the need, as George generally did, and had already sent a telegram. The reply had arrived at 6 o'clock. George had held it until a suitable moment, which he had judged to be after the pavilion rescue and the change of shoes, but before Poirot reached full analytical velocity, and on the reasonable grounds that information delivered at the wrong moment tends to be absorbed into whatever conclusion is already forming rather than permitted to correct it. Poirot read the reply now for the 3rd time. It confirmed what he had suspected about the Vale family's history and Iris's provenance in the careful, evidenced way of a firm that understood the difference between supposition and fact. It also contained one detail that he had not anticipated. A name, connected to the Blackmoor estate records, appearing in the year of Iris's birth, and not again until recently. A name associated with a firm of solicitors in a market town 12 miles from the Kent coast. Not the Gray's Inn firm that Thomas had telephoned. A different firm. An older connection, predating Thomas's involvement entirely. The solicitors who had, 15 years ago, drawn up the amended instrument of inheritance, and who had, according to the inquiry agent's report, or been contacted within the fortnight, by a client requesting copies of the original documents. The unaltered originals, which were required by law to be retained. The client's name was not given. The client had attended in person. Though the description offered by the agent, obtained from a clerk at the firm who had found the visit memorable for reasons he could not entirely articulate, was of a dark-eyed man of scholarly appearance who asked his questions with the patient precision of someone who had rehearsed them many times and was now simply performing a task already completed in his mind. Poirot sat for a long time with the report in his hands. Then he did something he had not done since his arrival at Blackmoor House. He laughed, softly, briefly, with genuine appreciation. The solicitor's archive in London, the Gray's Inn firm, had seemed for 2 days like a destination, the place the investigation was meant to reach. And he had felt, without being able to say precisely why, that he was being steered toward it. He was being steered away from the Kent firm. The greenhouse, the fire, the pavilion, the elaborate sequence of staged scenes. All of it had been calibrated to hold his attention here, in Blackmoor-on-Sea, while the documents that would settle everything were being secured elsewhere. The real move had already been made. He had been watching the wrong board. He was not angry. He was, if anything, more interested than before. He wrote a second telegram to the inquiry agents, brief and specific, and left it on the hall table for the first morning post. Then he returned to the library and sat down before his paper with the names on it and the line drawn between 2 of them, whilst considered the announcement he would make in the morning. The closing night of the exhibition was in 2 days. He would use the time that remained. He would announce with suitable gravity and suitable visibility that he intended to reveal the architect of the week's events at the exhibition's final gathering. He would ensure the announcement reached everyone in the house and was understood to be in earnest. And he would then prepare, with care, either conditions under which the truth would not merely be spoken but demonstrated. Somewhere in the neighbouring flat, no, he corrected himself, in the neighbouring cottage, for this was Blackmoor-on-Sea, and not the Whitehaven mansions he would return to. A child's voice rose briefly in a fragment of song, and was hushed. Not the Belgian lullaby, something English and lighter, but the sound caught him for a moment, and he sat very still while it settled. He thought of his mother's kitchen. He thought of Iris Vale on the promenade bench, her teeth unsteady, her voice controlled, saying that she had always known there was something she was not being told. He picked up his pen. There were, he now saw, not 5 dolls missing from Lady Eleanor's cabinet. The 5 empty stands represented 5 people. But the exhibition's logic, the cold, curatorial intelligence behind it, had always pointed at a 6th absence. The original absence. The one from which every subsequent event had followed, as water follows the first crack in a vessel. The stand labelled Ward. That was not an absent doll. That was an absent person documented in brass and placed in a cabinet and displayed for 40 years as part of a collection. That was Iris. And someone had known it long before this week and had decided, with patience, with craft, and with a psychologist's understanding of what spectacle can accomplish when argument cannot, that it was time for the cabinet's final stand to be filled. Not with porcelain, with the truth. Chapter 8, The Counter Gambit. The penultimate morning of the exhibition arrived with a brightness that Poirot found in his current disposition faintly impertinent. The sea was impeccable. The roses along the yew hedge had been trimmed, he noted, since yesterday. New cuts, the stems an inch shorter, and the circles tightened. Pell had been at work before the house woke. Pell, who moved in silence through the margins of events. Pell, who had been first on the beach and had used the word heard rather than found. Pell, who had held the flower girl at the hedge gap with firmness, but not alarm, as though her presence there had confirmed something rather than surprised him. Poirot had not, he acknowledged to himself over his morning coffee, given sufficient thought to Pell, or he found the groundskeeper in the kitchen garden at 7, harvesting the last of the summer's climbing beans with the attentive patience of a man for whom the day's first task is its own sufficient reason. Poirot leaned against the gate and watched for a moment before speaking. Pell acknowledged his presence with a slight turn of the head, the acknowledgement of a man who does not startle because he has already registered your approach. "How long have you been in Lady Eleanor's employ?" Poirot asked. 19 years. Pell set a handful of beans in the trug. "Since the year Mr. Thomas came down from Oxford." "And before that?" "Estate work, various. Before that, the Navy." He worked without pausing. "You want to ask me something more direct, Monsieur Poirot?" It was not a question, and Poirot appreciated it as such. He came through the gate and stood on the path between the bean rows. "The girl, Nell. You knew she was coming before she arrived at the hedge." Pell considered the beans. "I had been told to expect a delivery." "By whom?" "By the young woman who has been using the old greenhouse." He set another handful in the trug, turned, and met Poirot's eye with the level composure of a man who has decided that a certain door, once opened, might as well be opened fully. "I have known her since she was 7 years old. She came to the house as a visitor with her brother, and on several occasions when Lady Eleanor still entertained more broadly. I knew who she was. I am not certain Lady Eleanor remembered that I did." The air in the kitchen garden smelled of turned earth and the last warmth of the season. A bee moved unhurriedly among the late flowers at the border. Poirot waited. "She came to me 3 weeks ago," Pell said. "Told me what she intended, asked whether I would leave the old greenhouse unlocked and say nothing of it. I am not a man who assists in deception as a rule." A pause in which a second handful of beans was harvested. "But I am also not a man who forgets what I have seen. And I have seen, in 19 years, a good deal of what this house does to the people inside it." Poirot looked at the groundskeeper for a long moment. Then he said, simply, "Thank you," and left him to his beans. There he spent the remainder of the morning in a series of conversations that he conducted with the particular care of a man placing objects on a shelf, each one in a specific position, each one serving the arrangement that would follow. He spoke with Inspector Crowe, to whom he communicated, in measured terms, both what he knew and what he intended, and from whom he received, in exchange, to the confirmation that the Kent solicitors had indeed produced their archived documents under a formal request, and that those documents were now in the hands of a London barrister engaged by a client whose name the solicitors were not at liberty to disclose. He spoke with George briefly about the doll cabinet. George listened, asked 2 questions, and departed with the expression of a man who finds his employer's requests unusual but has long since ceased to find them surprising. He spoke with Iris, who was pale and precise, and, now that the shock had metabolized into something more workable, possessed of a quiet determination that reminded Poirot, in its quality, if not its object, of the young woman in the brown dress. He did not tell Iris everything. He told her enough and watched her absorb it in the manner of someone integrating knowledge that has, on some level, always been expected. He did not speak with Marcus Vale. He was not yet ready to look at the answer when he could still see the question with such clarity. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he assembled the household in the drawing-room. Lady Eleanor sat upright in the chair nearest the fireplace, her pearls in their customary alignment, her expression that of a woman who has survived many gatherings and has learned to treat uncertainty as a form of weather, unpleasant, manageable, ultimately passing. Thomas stood by the window, his jacket on, and his keys in his pocket, in the posture of a man who has not yet decided whether to leave and is keeping the option available. Marcus Vale sat in the chair nearest the door, the chair, Poirot noted, from which the room's exits were most efficiently monitored, with his hands folded and his face in the composed, analytical repose of a man watching something he has watched many times before in his imagination. Iris sat slightly apart from the others on the small sofa beside the cabinet, or she did not look at Marcus. Poirot stood before the doll cabinet and allowed a moment of silence to do its work. "I have the honour," he said, "of informing you that the events of this week are, in their essential character, concluded. The person responsible is known to me. The evidence is secured. What remains is the formality of demonstration, and, for that, I require one further evening." He looked at each of them in turn with the unhurried specificity of a man taking attendance. I ask that you present yourselves in this room tomorrow night at the exhibition's closing, at 9 o'clock. I ask that no one depart Blackmoor-on-Sea before that hour." He paused. "I extend that invitation also to Inspector Crowe, with whom I have already spoken." Thomas said with a flatness that contained rather more than flatness, "You know who did this?" "I know who arranged it. I know why. I know the instrument and the motive and the history that produced both." Poirot tilted his head slightly, regarding the cabinet behind him without turning. "What I will show you tomorrow evening is not merely a solution, it is a record. This house has its own record, and it will be part of the proceedings." Lady Eleanor said nothing. Her fingers resting on the chair's arm were entirely still, the stillness of someone who has achieved stillness through effort rather than ease. Marcus Vale looked at Poirot with dark, attentive eyes and said, very quietly, "I see." He said nothing else, but the two words had the quality of a sentence considerably longer than two words, and Poirot received them as such. He dismissed the gathering and went directly to the doll cabinet. He had asked George that morning to procure a single object from the town, a task that George had accomplished with his usual economy of means, yet returning before noon with a brown paper parcel of appropriate dimensions. Poirot now retrieved this parcel from behind the cabinet's base and unwrapped it at the table. A mirror, oval, its frame plain wood, its face clear and clean, approximately the height of one of the cabinet's dolls. He unlocked the cabinet, removed the doll on the stand that currently occupied the position farthest from the door and therefore least visible from the room's entrance, and set the mirror in its place. He angled it with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about sightlines. The mirror faced into the room. From the doorway, a person approaching in darkness would not see it until they were close enough for it to show them their own face. He relocked the cabinet and stood back to assess the arrangement. A trap required three things: bait, concealment, and the certainty that the trapped creature would come. The bait was the announcement he had made in the drawing room, which would be considered by its true recipient as both a challenge and a deadline. The concealment was the darkness of the gallery after hours, the single cabinet lamp left burning on its lowest setting, and Poirot himself in the armchair behind the door, which opened inward and would obscure him entirely from anyone entering. The certainty was of a simpler order. The will that had designed this week's events was not the will of a person who abandons an unfinished work. But there remained the question of the documents, the real will, the amended instrument, the legal foundation of everything. He had told the household, carefully, within Crow's hearing, in a sentence whose every word was chosen, that the final documents had been secured in the library. He had then, with George's assistance and the library's back window, moved them to an entirely different location. The library was a very comfortable room in which to conduct a search that would produce nothing. He spent the remaining hours of the afternoon in his room, rereading the inquiry agent's report with the attention it now deserved, adding to his reconstruction the details that the morning's conversation with Pell had provided, and allowing the completed picture to settle into its final form with the patience of a man who has learned that conclusions reached in haste tend to contain, somewhere in their structure, a fracture that widens under examination. When he was satisfied, he capped his pen, aligned his papers with the table's edge, and sat quietly for a time. The case, as a case, was solved. The mechanism was clear, the motive was clear, the evidence, documentary and observed, was sufficient. What remained was not detective work, but something closer to theatre. And Poirot had always understood that the performance of a solution is not vanity, but function. The truth, stated in company and in full, acquires a permanence and a witness that private knowledge cannot equal. He thought about the young woman in the brown dress, who had been in his thoughts at intervals since the pier, and whose role he had now fully understood. She had not been a principal. She had been a messenger, delivering the first piece to Poirot, managing the child Nell, watching the greenhouse from the hedge. She was the outer circle of this, present by devotion rather than design. He thought she was probably, in some quiet and fundamental way, afraid of what the week might cost the person she was protecting. He did not think she was wrong to be afraid. At 8 o'clock he descended to dinner, which was a subdued affair at which everyone ate with reasonable appetite and spoke with reasonable civility, and nobody said anything of the remotest interest or significance, which was itself, Poirot thought, a form of communication. Afterward, he sat in the drawing-room for an hour reading, and then retired, and lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the sea. He was not apprehensive. He was, he realized, in the quiet way of a man who has found the thing he came to find and knows what the morning will ask of him. Entirely ready. Chapter 9. Checkmate. The house settled into silence by 10:30. Poirot had watched the lights go out, window by window, from his position in the armchair behind the drawing-room door. He had not lit any lamp of his own. The single cabinet light burned on its lowest setting as he had arranged it, casting a thin amber wash across the porcelain faces in their rows. All those serene, obedient expressions, all those mended wrists, and leaving the remainder of the room in a darkness that was almost complete. He sat with considerable stillness, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes adjusted to the dark. He was neither tense nor drowsy. He was, and in the manner he had cultivated over 30 years of waiting in rooms for things to happen, simply present. The clock in the hall struck 11. then the quarter, then the half. At 20 minutes before midnight, the drawing-room door opened. It opened slowly, with the controlled care of someone who has considered the creak of hinges in advance and has accounted for it, one hand on the door's edge, regulating its arc. A figure entered, paused to allow its eyes to adjust, and moved toward the cabinet. Its footsteps on the parquet were as quiet as footsteps can be made, without crossing into the register of stealth. Careful rather than furtive, the distinction being one that Poirot had always considered significant. The figure reached the cabinet, a hand, gloved, extended toward the lock. "The lock has not been changed," Poirot said from the darkness behind the door. The key Lady Eleanor gave you at the beginning of the week will still serve." The figure was still for 3 seconds. Then, with a composure that Poirot found genuinely impressive, it turned. Dr. Marcus Vale stood in the amber light of the cabinet lamp. He wore his day clothes, the jacket slightly creased, as though he had not changed but had lain down in them. And his expression was precisely what Poirot had expected. Not the expression of a man caught, but of a man arrived. The expression of someone who has been moving toward a specific point for a long time, and has at last reached it, regardless of who is present to observe the arrival. He looked at the cabinet, then, as his eyes adjusted fully, he looked at the mirror placed where the final doll had been, and saw his own face looking back at him from among the porcelain. Something moved in his expression. Not shock and not quite irony, but the close cousin of both. "Very good," he said. Poirot rose from the armchair and came forward into the amber light. They regarded one another across the cabinet with the mutual, undisguised attentiveness of two men who have, in a sense, been conducting a conversation all week without using words, and are now arrived at the point where words become unavoidable. "You will sit down," Poirot said. It was not unkind. It was not entirely a question. Vale sat on the sofa beside the cabinet, with the fluid ease of a man settling into a posture he has rehearsed. Poirot took the chair opposite and considered him for a moment before speaking. "You were not searching for documents," Poirot said. "You secured the documents last week from the Kent solicitors, before you arrived at Blackmoor House. Everything you required was in your possession before this exhibition began." He paused. "You came tonight because I told you I would name you tomorrow evening, and you wished to assess, to see what remained in the cabinet that might corroborate or contradict." Vale inclined his head, fractionally. "And the library?" "Empty of anything useful. You are welcome to verify this, though I suspect you have done so already." "An hour ago," Vale said without embarrassment. "I found nothing, which told me the documents were elsewhere, which told me you had anticipated the library as a destination." He looked at Poirot with the level, analytical attention that Poirot now understood. He was not a professional manner layered over a private one, but simply his manner throughout. The gaze of a man to whom observation is not a tool, but a condition of existence. "I underestimated the speed at which you would arrive at the whole of it." "You did not underestimate me," Poirot said with quiet precision. "You calculated that I would solve it, and you planned accordingly. What you underestimated was the timeline. You expected 3 or 4 days more." Vale was silent for a moment. Then, "Yes." The admission was without artifice. Poirot appreciated it. "Then let us be exact," Poirot said, and proceeded to be so. He had arranged Iris's assault on the peer woman's behalf, feeding Poirot the broken finger through a channel he would find credible and investigate rather than dismiss. He had used Nell, the flower girl, as a second relay, delivering the porcelain hand to establish physical continuity of evidence. He had staged Clara's arrangement on the beach, not to harm her, never to harm her, but to open the investigation formally, to bring Poirot into the house's interior as a sanctioned presence with the authority to ask the questions that needed asking. The greenhouse had been his workshop, the fire set by his own hand on the morning Poirot was led there, time to destroy the physical apparatus once its evidential purpose was served. He had telephoned the pavilion himself, out in the voice stripped of affect, the voice of a psychologist who understands that affectlessness reads as authority. And he had known, from the tide table he had been studying for a fortnight, exactly how much time remained. The Belgian lullaby, Poirot's provenance, his mother's village, the specific regional melody. All of it gathered in 2 months of research conducted in Spa, Brussels, and the London Library. Was it because Vale had decided that Poirot specifically was the witness he required and had prepared for him as one prepares for a particular kind of soil before planting? "You needed me," Poirot said. "Not merely a detective. Me. Someone whose reconstruction, once given publicly, would carry weight sufficient to counter 15 years of Lady Eleanor's management of the record." "The documents alone would have been disputed," Vale said. His voice was measured, but underneath it ran a current that Poirot now heard clearly. Not anger precisely, but the compressed force of something that has been held under pressure for a long time. Lady Eleanor has solicitors, connections, and 40 years of practiced credibility. A barrister's brief is not the same as a narrative. I needed the narrative built by someone she could not dismiss. He looked at the cabinet. I needed the whole of it made visible, not merely the legal fraction. "And so you made a theatre of it," Poirot said. "A theatre in which living people served as your properties." The silence that followed this had a different quality from the ones preceding it. Vale met his gaze without deflection. Clara was not in danger at any point. The cliff path was dry, the fall controlled, the arrangement afterward done with care. I was on the beach within 90 seconds. He paused. "The pavilion. I miscalculated the infiltration rate by 4 minutes. I was outside when you arrived." Something shifted in his face, briefly and unwillingly, at this. I did not intend her to be frightened to the degree she was. "But she was," Poirot said quietly. "And you knew that fear was a probable consequence when you locked that door." Vale said nothing. "Iris is not your sister," Poirot said. "She is Lady Eleanor's illegitimate granddaughter, and her father was Lady Eleanor's son by an earlier, unacknowledged marriage, or a liaison of equivalent legal complexity. And her mother died before the matter could be regularized. Lady Eleanor had the child placed with you, and the documents amended. The inheritance was redirected entirely to Thomas. And Iris grew up beside you, cared for, protected, loved in the real sense of that word, and stripped in the same motion of her name, her origin, and a fortune." He stopped. "You have known all of this for how long?" 12 years, Vale said. "Since I was 26, and a colleague with an interest in estate law made a comment at a conference about a case he had read with an unusual configuration of wardship instruments. The description was too particular. I began to look. 12 years. Poirot absorbed this. 12 years of knowing and waiting and, presumably, deciding what knowing required of him. "You could have gone to the law directly," Poirot said. "You had the documents. You had sufficient evidence for a challenge. And Lady Eleanor would have managed it, as she has managed everything. A dispute, a counterfiling, delays of years. Iris put through a public ordeal at the end of which, perhaps, a judgment." He looked at his hands. "Iris is not robust, Monsieur Poirot. She has spent her life adjacent to a truth she could sense but not name, and it has cost her. I could not put her through a legal war of attrition against a woman who has been winning such wars for 6 decades. The composure in his voice thinned for the first time to something raw beneath. "I needed it to be over, quickly and completely, and in such a way that it could not be managed away." Silence. The clock in the hall moved toward midnight. "You were injured," Poirot said after a while. "What was done to Iris was a genuine injury. What was done to you, in raising her without being told the truth, was also an injury. And Lady Eleanor's management of this family has caused damage of a kind that does not show on the surface, but goes very deep." He paused. "None of this grants permission to use frightened people as instruments, however carefully their fear is calculated." Vale received this without resistance, in the manner of a man who has said the same thing to himself on a number of occasions and found it insufficient to change his course. "Was I wrong?" he asked. Poirot looked at him, at the controlled face and the careful hands and the long, patient, privately devastating intelligence behind both. "You were injured," he said gently. "But injury does not grant permission to injure." He let this settle. "You will answer to Inspector Crowe in the morning. The charges, given the circumstances and the absence of lasting harm, may be of a manageable nature. That is not my determination to make." He stood. What is my determination to make? I have made." Vale looked up at him. Something in his expression, the held composure, the analytical surface, the long containment of 12 years, released not dramatically but quietly, like a weight set down at the end of a walk. "You would have solved it," he said, "eventually, without the theatre." "Oui," Poirot said. "I would have solved it, but you chose to gamble with human lives in order to accelerate justice. And that, mon ami, there is a gamble that is never yours to take." Vale nodded once. The nod of a chess player acknowledging a superior move by tipping, with quiet dignity, his king. He did not resist when Crowe, who had been in the hall since 11 o'clock at Poirot's prior arrangement, appeared in the doorway. He rose, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door, with the composed, forward-looking attention of a man who has finished one thing, and is, in whatever way remains available to him, already thinking about the next. At the threshold he paused without turning. "Tell Iris," he said, "that the documents are with the barrister, that it is all in order, that she does not need to be afraid of the house any longer." He went out. Poirot stood alone in the drawing-room for a time, in the amber light of the cabinet lamp and the company of 19 porcelain faces, all their expressions of serene, obedient composure now seeming to him, in the silence after the doors close, a less like the peace of perfection and more like the patience of things that have been waiting a very long time for someone to open the glass. Chapter 10. The World. After Inspector Crowe conducted his business with the same unfussy competence that Poirot had come to respect over the course of the week. He took Vale's statement in the morning room with 2 constables present and a shorthand clerk who had been summoned from the town at 7 o'clock, and he asked his questions in the careful, sequential manner of a man building a structure one brick at a time. Each question placed precisely, nothing doubled back upon unnecessarily, nothing important omitted. Vale answered everything. He held nothing in reserve. He gave the clerk's pencil so much material that the young man's hand was cramping by 11 o'clock, and he delivered it all with the same forward-looking composure he had carried out of the drawing-room the previous night. Not contrition performed for effect, but the practical, unsentimental accounting of a man who has done what he decided was necessary and is prepared to accept what that decision costs. Crowe, when he finally rose and thanked Vale for his cooperation, did so with a courtesy that was not, Poirot thought, entirely professional. There was in it the private recognition of one methodical man for another. He told Vale that he was not to leave Blackmoor on sea, that further interviews would be required, and that the question of charges would be referred to his superiors, and ultimately to the Crown prosecution, whose determination would depend materially on the medical assessments of Clara and Iris, and the degree of lasting harm, physical or psychological, that could be established. This last point both Crowe and Poirot knew was the relevant one. The charges available were real but fragile. Vale had arranged fear without delivering lasting injury, which placed him in that uncomfortable legal territory where the gravity of the moral offence and the narrowness of the statutory one do not comfortably align. Crowe left at noon. As he passed Poirot in the hall, he said without stopping that it had been an instructive week, and that he hoped the next time Monsieur Poirot visited the Kentish coast, it would be under circumstances of greater restfulness. Poirot said he hoped the same, and meant it somewhat less than his tone suggested. Lady Eleanor was told at 10 o'clock. Poirot did this himself in the library, with the door closed, and George stationed with unobtrusive tact in the corridor outside. He told her plainly and fully, with neither harshness nor unnecessary softening, what had been established about Iris's origin, what the documents confirmed, and what the legal consequences for the estate were likely to be. He watched her receive it. She was seated when he began, and she was seated when he finished, and she did not, at any point, raise her voice or produce any of the performances of distress that some people deploy in such moments as a substitute for feeling them. She sat with her hands in her lap and her pearls in their alignment and her face doing something that was not quite composed and not quite broken, occupying with the practiced difficulty of a woman of her generation and formation what the space between those two conditions. When he was finished, she said, after a considerable pause, "I believed I was protecting the family." "I know," Poirot said. "She would have been impossible. Her mother's circumstances, the scandal, Thomas's position." "I know," Poirot said again in the same quiet tone. "I did not think of her as—" She stopped. The sentence had encountered something it could not traverse. "No," Poirot said gently. "That, I think, was the difficulty." Lady Eleanor looked at the bookshelves, at the annotated volumes with their small, precise marginalia. All that accumulated thinking about children and formation and the consequences of early circumstance, applied with such rigour to theory and so little to the particular child in her own history. Something in her face settled into a weariness that was the most honest thing he had seen her produce all week. She did not collapse. She did not ask for sympathy. Thus she straightened her pearls with 2 fingers and said that she would speak to her solicitors and that she imagined the process would be a long one. It would be. Poirot said so plainly. The amended instruments would be challenged. The estate would likely be subject to lengthy legal determination. Thomas's position as the beneficiary of an instrument now under formal dispute would become untenable in its present form. He left her in the library with the morning light on the shelves and the sound of the sea coming through the cracked window, and felt, walking down the corridor, not satisfaction and not sorrow, but the particular gravity of a thing concluded that has cost more than any of its participants had originally understood. Thomas left Blackmoor House that afternoon. He came to find Poirot before going, which Poirot had not expected and which accordingly raised him slightly in Poirot's estimation. He stood in the hall with his luggage at the door and said, with a directness that may have been the first entirely unmanaged thing he had produced in several days, that he had not known. About Iris. He wanted that stated clearly, and he wanted Poirot to believe it. Poirot told him, honestly, that he did believe it. The ignorance was not to Thomas's credit. A man of 40 living in a house whose history he has never examined is complicit in his own blindness. But it was genuine ignorance, and Poirot did not see the purpose of adding false charges to real ones. Thomas nodded, took his bag, and walked out through the front door without looking back at the house. The door closed behind him with a sound that was neither dramatic nor inconsequential. It was simply the sound of a door. He found Iris in the garden in the late afternoon, sitting on the bench at the cliff's edge from which the bay was visible in its full extent. The white chalk headlands, at the pier with its afternoon bunting, the sea in its improbable and continuing blue. She had a cup of tea and was not drinking it. She was looking at the horizon with an expression that was very still and very much her own. He sat beside her. For a time neither of them spoke, which was, he felt, entirely appropriate to the moment. "Marcus told me," she said at last, "that the documents are with the barrister, that it is all in order." "That is correct." "He also said—" She paused, with the careful pause of someone choosing between several true things. "He said he was sorry, not for what he tried to do, for how frightened I was." "That is a distinction worth preserving," Poirot said. Iris looked at the sea. "I do not know what I'm supposed to feel about any of it." "No," Poirot agreed. "You are not supposed to feel anything in particular. You are simply permitted to feel what you feel as it arrives, and without obligation to arrive at it in any specific order or on any schedule." She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was one he had seen before in people who have received, unexpectedly, a form of permission they did not know they had been waiting for. They heard footsteps on the garden path, Clara coming from the house, her coat pulled around her and her hair loose. The bruise on her cheekbone faded now to the yellow of a thing nearly healed. Or as she stopped when she saw them and might, for a fraction of a second, have turned back. Then she came forward and sat on the bench's other end, leaving the correct amount of space between herself and Iris, that is neither separation nor intimacy, but something honestly provisional. The three of them sat looking at the bay. "I have been thinking," Clara said after a while, "about where to go." She said it to the sea rather than to either of them. "Whether anywhere in particular suggests itself." "Somewhere without managed gardens," Iris said. Clara glanced at her. Then, briefly, and with some evident surprise at herself, she smiled. Poirot left them to it. He departed Blackmoor on Sea on the following morning on the 9:15 from the coastal station, in a first-class compartment that was blessedly empty of other passengers. George had packed everything the night before with his usual thoroughness, in including the cedarwood tisane box and the small locked drawer's contents, which he had replaced in their travelling case without comment. The train moved through the summer countryside, the Kentish orchards, the hop fields, the long chalk ridges, and Poirot sat with his hands folded and watched it go by with the mild pleasure of a man returning to his proper element. London, his flat, the symmetrical arrangement of his sitting room, the coffee that arrived, when George made it, and at the correct temperature and in the correct cup. He thought about the young woman in the brown dress, whose name he now knew was Cecile, and who was the daughter of a friend of Marcus Vale's from his university years, a woman of considerable nerve and considerable loyalty, both of which, in Poirot's estimation, she had exercised rather more wisely than the person she had been protecting. He hoped she had gone home. He thought she probably had. He thought about Pell, trimming his roses in the early morning, who had spent 19 years in a house whose history he understood better than its owner suspected, and had decided in the end that 3 weeks of unlocked doors and deliberate silence was the price he was prepared to pay for it. He thought about the 5 names on the paper and about the single line he had drawn between 2 of them, and about how the line had proved to be not between a perpetrator and a victim, but between 2 people shaped by the same wrong, differently at different distances with different instruments, and carrying it, until this week, in different kinds of silence. The train entered a tunnel, and the window went dark for a moment, and when the light returned the landscape had changed, and they were closer to London. That evening, in the quiet of the Whitehaven Mansions flat, Poirot sat in his armchair with his coffee and his customary order re-established around him. The ornaments in their positions, the cushions at their correct angles, the clock ticking with the reliable exactitude he had always found consoling. George had gone out. The flat was still. From the neighbouring flat drifted the sound of a gramophone, and on it, faintly but distinctly, a woman's voice singing something slow and repetitive, its melody moving through its phrases with the patient, or circling rhythm of a song designed to accompany the closing of eyes. It was not the Belgian lullaby. It was something English, quite different, but it had the same quality. That quality all lullabies share, regardless of language, of being addressed to someone small and undefended, and in need of being told that the night is manageable. Poirot sat with his coffee cooling in his hand and listened to it for longer than he ordinarily would have done. Then he set the cup down. I adjusted his left cufflink. It had been fractionally loose since the train, a small imprecision he had been permitting himself until the moment felt right for correcting it, and sat for a moment in the silence after the song had ended. He thought of Iris on the cliff bench, looking at the sea, of 2 women sitting at the correct provisional distance from one another, saying something true to the horizon, of a house that had, for this 1 week at least, been made to account for what it had held. He picked up the evening paper. Miss Lemon had left the week's correspondence in its customary pile, and there were 3 letters that had the look of professional inquiries. He did not open them yet. He allowed himself another moment of stillness, which was, in its own way, a form of the same courtesy he had extended to Iris, the permission to feel what one feels, in the order in which it arrives, without hurrying toward the next thing. Then he opened the first letter. there would always be another case. This, for Hercule Poirot, had never been a source of weariness. It was, in its way, the whole point.